A struggling single mom braves a winter storm to feed her sick, reclusive billionaire neighbor. She thinks it's just one act of kindness, but when her little boy whispers a shocking secret, the walls of that cold mansion shake with truth. The billionaire begins to see warmth in the small kitchen table he never knew he needed. But when the town's gossip, old lies, and a ruthless betrayal threaten to rip them apart, suddenly, soup and kindness are no longer enough to hold their fragile world together. What happens when compassion collides with power, and the meaning of family is rewritten forever? Will a simple meal heal years of loneliness, or destroy everything they love? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled through the streets of Willow Bend, whipping snow into angry swirls that stung any exposed skin. Elena Cruz stood at her duplex window, watching as one by one the lights across town blinked out. The power lines, heavy with ice, had finally given up their fight against winter's fury. "Mommy, it's getting colder," Micah called from his nest of blankets on the couch. At 8 years old, he had already mastered the art of building blanket fortresses. Elena struck another match, lighting the third candle on their coffee table. "I know, mi amor, but we've got our special emergency candles, remember? And look how cozy you are in your blanket castle." The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Elena moved to the kitchen. Their small home might not be much, but it held warmth beyond what any heater could provide. The scent of her grandmother's caldo de pollo, chicken soup, still filled the air from dinner. A particularly fierce gust rattled the windows, drawing Elena's attention back outside. Across the street, the massive Hale estate loomed like a dark mountain against the swirling snow. No lights. Not even a flicker. "Mr. Hale's house is all dark too," Micah observed, his face pressed against the cold window pane. Elena's stomach tightened. Graydon Hale, the town's mysterious billionaire who rarely ventured beyond his gates. People whispered about him at the diner where she worked, spinning tales about why such a wealthy man chose their small town. Some said he was hiding from scandal. Others claimed he was just another rich man looking down on them all. But something didn't feel right. The estate had a generator. She'd heard its weekly tests. Why wasn't it running? "Mommy, you've got your worried face on," Micah said, studying her with those perceptive eyes that sometimes saw too much. Elena touched the cross at her neck, a habit when she needed guidance. "I'm just thinking, Mr. Hale lives all alone up there. What if he needs help? Like how Pastor Danny says we should love our neighbors?" Micah's face brightened with understanding. "Exactly like that." Elena squared her shoulders. "Even neighbors in big scary houses?" Micah nodded solemnly. "Even them." Moving quickly before her courage failed, Elena ladled the remaining soup into a large pot. "Bundle up tight, mi amor. We're going to check on Mr. Hale." They wrapped themselves in layers, scarves, hats, their warmest coats. Elena tucked the pot of soup into a bag, grabbed a flashlight, and took Micah's mittened hand in hers. The wind nearly knocked them over as they stepped outside. Snow had already buried their front steps, and more was falling fast. Elena held Micah close as they crossed the street, their boots crunching through fresh powder. The Hale estate's iron gates were thankfully unlocked. As they trudged up the long driveway, Elena's doubts grew with each step. What was she thinking, bringing her son to a stranger's home in the middle of a storm? But then she remembered her abuela's words, "Perfect love casts out fear." The massive front door loomed before them, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the beam of Elena's flashlight. She reached for the brass knocker, her hand trembling slightly. The sound echoed like thunder in the storm's chaos. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. Micah pressed against her leg, his earlier bravery wavering. "Maybe he's sleeping?" Micah whispered. Elena was about to agree when she heard movement inside. Slow, unsteady footsteps approaching the door. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Graydon Hale stood before them, but not the imposing figure she'd glimpsed from afar. His face was pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, wearing what looked like expensive pajamas under a silk robe. Despite his obvious illness, he still managed to arch an eyebrow at the unexpected visitors. "Mrs. Cruz?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He swayed slightly, and Elena could feel the heat radiating from him even from where she stood. "You have a fever," she said, maternal instincts overriding any intimidation she might have felt. "And no power. We brought soup." He stared at them, as if they were speaking a foreign language, his usual sharp composure completely undone by illness and surprise. "You? Brought soup?" "Mommy's soup makes everything better," Micah piped up, peeking around Elena's leg. "It's caldo de pollo. That means chicken soup," he added helpfully. Graydon Hale, the man who could buy and sell half the town without blinking, looked utterly lost in the face of this simple kindness. He opened his mouth to respond, but a violent shiver ran through him instead. "You shouldn't be standing in this cold," Elena said firmly. "Please let us help." For a long moment he simply looked at them, the single mother and her son, standing in the snowstorm with a pot of soup, offering help to a man who supposedly needed nothing from anyone. Something shifted in his fever-bright eyes, a crack in the careful walls he'd built around himself. He started, then caught himself on the doorframe as another wave of dizziness hit. Elena stepped forward instinctively to steady him. Through his silk robe she could feel him trembling with fever. Up close, she was struck by how human he looked. Not the distant figure of town gossip, but a sick man alone in a dark house during a storm. "We're coming in," Elena declared, her tone brooking no argument. "Micah, grab the soup bag, mi amor. Mr. Hale needs to sit down before he falls down." And there they stood at the threshold, the billionaire, the single mother, and the little boy, while the storm raged around them, about to cross a boundary that would change all their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The marble countertop felt like ice under Elena's hands as she set down the pot of soup. In the beam of her flashlight, Graydon Hale's kitchen seemed to stretch endlessly, all gleaming surfaces and professional-grade appliances that looked like they'd never been used. Without power, the space felt abandoned, like a museum after hours. "The generator," Graydon mumbled, leaning heavily against a bar stool. "In the basement." "You should sit down before you fall down," Elena interrupted, guiding him onto the stool. Even through his silk robe, she could feel the heat of his fever. "Micah, honey, can you shine the flashlight for me while I look around?" "I'm going to set up my puzzle," Micah announced instead, already wandering toward what appeared to be a living room. "The coffee table looks big enough." "Micah, we can't just—" Elena started, but Graydon waved a dismissive hand. "Let him," he said, his voice rough. "It's fine." Another violent shiver ran through him. Elena bit back a frustrated sigh. The kitchen had to have some basic supplies. She began opening drawers and cabinets, methodically searching. "When was the last time you ate something?" "I'm perfectly capable of—" A coughing fit cut off his protest. "That's not what I asked." Elena finally found what she was looking for, a drawer with flashlights and batteries. She clicked one on, filling the kitchen with steady light. How long? Graydon's usual sharp demeanor had crumbled under the weight of illness. He looked smaller somehow, slumped on the bar stool. "What day is it?" "Thursday." He frowned, as if doing complex calculations. "Monday? Perhaps Sunday?" "Dios mío," Elena muttered under her breath. No wonder he could barely stand. She set the flashlight upright on the counter, creating a pool of light to work in. "Where do you keep your bowls?" "Mrs. Cruz, while I appreciate the gesture, I don't require—" "The bowls, Mr. Hale?" Their eyes met across the counter. Elena knew that look, the stubborn pride of someone unused to accepting help. She'd worn it herself often enough. "Upper cabinet, left of the sink," he finally conceded. From the living room came the soft sounds of Micah dumping out his puzzle pieces. "Mom, this room is huge. And there's a piano." "Don't touch anything without permission, mi amor," Elena called back. She found the bowls, fine china that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and chose the plainest one she could find. As she ladled the soup, steam rising in the cold air, she studied Graydon more carefully. His normally perfect hair was disheveled, his face flushed with fever. The elegant robe couldn't hide how he hugged himself against the chill. "The generator," he tried again. "I should check." "You should eat," Elena said firmly, sliding the bowl in front of him. The generator can wait until you have something in your stomach and some medicine in your system. Do you have any Tylenol? Upstairs, master bathroom. He stared at the soup as if he'd forgotten what food was. Mrs. Cruz, I'm sure you have better things to do than help a neighbor who's sick and alone during a storm? She raised an eyebrow. What would you have done if we hadn't come? I would have managed. Like you've been managing for the past 3 or 4 days? A flash of his usual sharpness returned to his eyes. I don't need a lecture. No, you need soup. Eat. From the living room, Micah's voice drifted back. Mom, can you help me sort the edge pieces? In a minute, honey. She watched as Graydon lifted the spoon with an unsteady hand. Careful, it's hot. He took a small sip, and something extraordinary happened. His eyes widened slightly, and a sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sigh. The surprise on his face suggested he hadn't expected either reaction. This is. He took another spoonful, more eagerly this time. I haven't tasted anything like this since. He trailed off, lost in some memory. Since when? But he shook his head, focusing on the soup instead. Color began returning to his face as he ate, though Elena could still see him fighting shivers. I'll find that Tylenol, she decided. Which way to your room? Mrs. Cruz. Elena, she corrected. If we're going to argue about me helping you, you might as well use my first name. Another surprised laugh escaped him, smaller this time but just as genuine. Elena then. But I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. That's what neighbors do. She picked up the flashlight. Master bathroom? He sighed, clearly recognizing a lost battle. Top of the stairs, end of the hall on the right. But really, eat your soup, Mr. Hale. Graydon? He said quietly. When she turned back, he was staring into the bowl, as if it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. If I'm to use your first name, you should use mine. Elena nodded, feeling something shift in the cold air between them. Eat your soup, Graydon. I'll be right back. As she headed for the stairs, she heard Micah chattering away in the living room about his puzzle, something about spaceships and stars. Then, softer, she heard another small chuckle from the kitchen. The sound followed her up the dark stairs, echoing in the empty halls of the massive house. It wasn't much, just a moment of warmth in a cold place. But it felt like the first crack in a long frozen winter, the first hint that spring might somehow find its way in. Morning light crept through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Elena's back ached from sleeping upright in one of Graydon's stiff dining chairs, but she couldn't bring herself to leave him alone with such a high fever. Micah was curled up on the leather couch, his puzzle pieces scattered nearby. She found Graydon slumped in an expensive armchair, his breathing finally even. Pressing the back of her hand to his forehead, she felt the fever had broken at last. Relief washed over her. The worst had passed. Elena gathered Micah's blanket from the floor and tucked it around him before getting to work. The kitchen needed attention first. As she wiped down counters and put away dishes from the night before, she hummed softly, "Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see." The familiar hymn filled the quiet house as she moved through the rooms, straightening pillows and gathering used tissues. Her mother had always said that cleanliness brought clarity, and this place could use some warmth. "You have a lovely voice," Elena startled, nearly dropping the tissue box. Graydon was watching her from his chair, his eyes clearer now, though still heavy with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He shifted, grimacing at stiff muscles. "How long have you been here?" "All night. Your fever was dangerous." Elena busied herself with folding a throw blanket. "There's more soup when you're ready to eat." Graydon reached for his phone on the side table, frowning at the dark screen. "The power's still out?" "The whole neighborhood. But we're managing." She didn't mention how worried she was about the food spoiling in her own fridge, or the heating bill that would come from running space heaters once power returned. He nodded absently, already typing on his phone. Elena returned to the kitchen, reheating soup on the gas stove she'd figured out how to light. Behind her, she heard his quiet voice speaking to someone. "Campbell? Yes, I know what time it is. I need generators. As many as you can get to Willow Bend within the hour. No, not just for the estate. The whole street at least. I don't care about the cost. Just get it done." Elena pretended not to hear, focusing on stirring the soup. Rich people and their connections must be nice to solve problems with a single phone call. But an hour later, when trucks rolled up with industrial generators and crews began connecting houses one by one, she had to admit it was a kindness she hadn't expected. From the window, she watched neighbors emerging from their homes, calling thanks to the workers. Children cheered as lights blinked on down the street. The mansion hummed to life, warmth flooding back through the vents. Micah woke up and immediately returned to his puzzle, chattering about the pieces he still needed to find. "The blue sky part is really hard," he informed Graydon, who had managed to make it to the couch. "Want to help?" To Elena's surprise, Graydon lowered himself to the floor beside her son. "I suppose I could try." She left them to their puzzle solving, using the restored power to properly clean up. The kitchen slowly came to order under her hands. As she worked, the sound of a single piano key drew her attention. Graydon had moved to the grand piano in the corner, pressing one note repeatedly, as if lost in thought. Elena approached to gather some stray puzzle pieces near the instrument, but a framed photograph on top of it caught her eye. Her hand froze mid-reach. The coastal estate in the picture was unmistakable. The sweeping lawn, the rose gardens, the private beach beyond. She knew every inch of those grounds because she'd tended them herself as a teenage maid, years ago, and now she remembered where she'd first seen Graydon Hale, standing in that very garden, looking just as lonely then as he did now. The memory struck her like a physical blow. She must have made some sound, because Graydon looked up from the piano keys. Their eyes met, and Elena saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his expression. "You worked there," he said softly. "At my mother's estate." The piano key fell silent, leaving only the gentle hum of electricity and Micah's quiet humming as he worked on his puzzle. A shout of joy from outside broke the moment. Another house's lights coming back on. Elena turned away from the photograph, from the memories it stirred, from the questions in Graydon's eyes. "The soup should be hot now," she said, her voice carefully steady. "You need to eat to keep your strength up." She moved back to the kitchen, away from the piano and its dangerous reminders of a summer long ago, when she'd been young enough to believe that kindness could bridge any distance, even the vast gulf between a maid and the son of the house. Behind her, another piano key sounded, soft and hesitant in the brightening morning. Elena's fingers trembled as she picked up the silver-framed photograph from the piano. The familiar white columns and sweeping veranda of the Hale coastal estate transported her back 7 years. She could almost smell the salt air and hear seagulls crying overhead. "I worked there," she said softly, more to herself than to Graydon. "As a maid, during that summer." Graydon shifted in his armchair, his fever-bright eyes focusing on the photo. "Mother's pride and joy. That house has been in the family for generations." Elena traced the edge of the frame. Every detail came rushing back: the weight of starched uniforms, the endless polishing of brass fixtures, the quiet satisfaction of turning chaos into order. But most of all, she remembered the service entrance where she'd sometimes catch glimpses of the owner's son during his visits. "The hydrangeas," Graydon murmured unexpectedly. "They bloomed blue that summer. And there was a girl." He paused, brow furrowing. She had music in her laugh, used to sing while folding linens in the east wing. Heat crept up Elena's neck. She'd always hummed while working, finding comfort in old hymns passed down from her grandmother. "That was me," she admitted. "Though we weren't supposed to make any noise. You'd slip extra cookies to the gardener's children," Graydon continued, his voice growing stronger with each recovered memory. "And you knew every constellation visible from the servants' courtyard." Elena's heart hammered. She hadn't expected him to remember so much. Those stolen moments of conversation had meant everything to her 19-year-old self. The shy smiles, the borrowed books, the way he'd listened when she spoke of her dreams for college. "You disappeared," he said quietly. "One day you were just gone." The old pain surfaced, sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Blackwood, the head housekeeper, she told your mother I was behaving inappropriately with you." Said I was trying to trap you. Elena's voice caught. It wasn't true. But they believed her without question. Graydon's face darkened. I never knew. Mother only said the new maid hadn't worked out. I wrote you at the staff address, but they'd already threatened legal action if I tried to contact anyone in the family. Elena set the photo down carefully. I lost my job, my reference letters, my chance at night classes. It took years to rebuild. Silence filled the massive room. Outside, the morning sun caught ice-covered branches, sending rainbow prisms dancing across the walls. Micah stirred on the couch, yawning as he gathered scattered puzzle pieces. I'm sorry, Graydon said finally. The power my family held holds it was wielded carelessly, cruelly. He met her eyes. You didn't deserve that. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. 7 years of carrying that rejection alone, and now here they were standing in his mansion, while winter light painted everything in shades of grace. We talked about stars, he remembered suddenly. You showed me Orion from the kitchen garden. Said his belt pointed to hope. You remembered that? A smile tugged at her lips despite the ache in her chest. I remember more than I should, perhaps. His voice was gentle. Your favorite flowers were our yellow roses. You drank tea with honey when your throat was sore from singing. You believed everyone deserved a second chance. Elena turned away, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his tone. She needed to gather Micah's things, get back to their tiny duplex, rebuild the careful walls between their worlds. But Micah was already at Graydon's side, tugging his sleeve with the innocent boldness of childhood. Mr. Hale? Micah whispered, his words clear in the hushed room. Graydon leaned down. Yes? Elena froze, suddenly alert to the gravity in her son's voice. Mommy says you're my daddy. The late afternoon shadows stretched across Graydon's kitchen floor as Micah tugged gently at his sleeve. The boy's dark eyes, so earnest and bright, looked up at him with complete trust. Mommy says you're my daddy, he whispered, his small voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. Elena's spoon clattered against the counter. The sound echoed off the marble surfaces like a gunshot. Her face drained of color as she gripped the edge of the granite countertop, knuckles white with tension. Graydon's mouth opened, then closed. He looked from Micah to Elena, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something else, a flicker of recognition perhaps, as he studied Micah's features more intently. Elena's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. I was going to tell you. Soon. I had it all planned out. How to explain everything properly. Micah, oblivious to the tension crackling through the kitchen, climbed onto a bar stool and swung his legs. I heard you telling Ms. Opal last week. When she brought over those lemon cookies? He smiled at the memory. She said sometimes the truth needs time to rise. Like bread. Elena closed her eyes briefly, pain-etching lines around her mouth. Micah, honey, that was a private conversation. But it's true, isn't it? Micah's innocent question hung in the air. That's why we brought soup when the lights went out, because family takes care of family. Graydon sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his legs suddenly unsteady. The fever that had barely broken seemed to return full force, making his head spin. He stared at his hands, spread flat on the table, then at Micah, really looking at him now. The boy's dark curls, the shape of his nose, the way his eyebrows drew together when he was thinking hard, just like 7 years ago, Graydon said slowly, his voice rough. At the coastal estate. Elena nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. That summer, before everything fell apart, Micah hopped down from his stool and went to his mother, pressing against her side. She automatically stroked his hair, drawing comfort from his presence. We had those talks by the service entrance, Graydon continued, memories surfacing like bubbles in still water. You were always humming while you worked, and that evening in the garden, the night of the summer solstice party, Elena whispered. When everyone else was inside dancing. One kiss, Graydon said. His eyes locked with Elena's. We promised to write, but then 3 days later I was fired, accused of stealing Mrs. Hale's jewelry. Elena's voice shook. Your mother's housekeeper said if I ever tried to contact you or the family again, they'd press charges. I was 18, scared, and pregnant," Graydon finished, the reality of it hitting him like a physical blow. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble. "Why didn't you find a way to tell me? All these years?" "I tried." The words burst from Elena like water through a breaking dam. "I wrote letters. They came back unopened. I called the estate, but they wouldn't put me through. Then the lawyers sent cease and desist warnings, and she drew a shaky breath. "I had to protect myself. Protect our baby." Micah looked between them, his small face serious. "Are you mad?" he asked Graydon. "That we didn't tell you before?" The simple question cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Graydon felt something in his chest crack open, whether from fever or emotion. He couldn't tell. "No, Micah," he said softly. "I'm not mad. I'm just trying to understand." Elena knelt beside Micah, smoothing his shirt with trembling hands. "Baby, why don't you go work on your puzzle in the living room for a few minutes? Mr. Hale and I need to talk." "Okay." Micah hugged his mother, then surprised them both by giving Graydon's leg a quick squeeze before trotting out of the kitchen. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. Through the doorway, they could hear the soft clicking of puzzle pieces as Micah worked, humming tunelessly to himself, just like Elena used to do. Graydon pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as the last effects of his fever made the room tilt. He steadied himself against the table, his gaze never leaving Elena's face. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled, despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. The kitchen felt impossibly small despite its grand size. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled out a chair from the breakfast nook, her legs no longer able to hold her up. Micah, sensing his mother's distress, climbed into her lap and wrapped his small arms around her neck. "I should have told you properly," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." Graydon stood frozen by the counter, his tall frame rigid with shock. His fingers curled around the edge of the marble, seeking stability in its cool surface. "Tell me now," he said, his voice hoarse but gentle. Elena drew in a deep breath, pulling Micah closer. "That summer at the coastal estate, I was 17, working as a maid to help my mother with bills. You would come to visit your parents on weekends." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "You always stopped by the service entrance with a kind word or a joke. No one else there treated us like people worth talking to." Graydon's expression softened as recognition dawned. "Elena with the laugh-like music," he murmured. "You used to sing while folding linens." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "One evening, you found me in the garden. I was picking herbs for the kitchen. We talked for hours about dreams and books and—" She swallowed hard. "You kissed me by the rose trellis. Just once. You promised to write when you returned to college." "But I never got any letters," Graydon said, his brow furrowing. "I wrote twice a week, for months. And I never got those either." Elena stroked Micah's hair as he nestled against her shoulder. "3 days after you left, Mrs. Tessa's mother, the head housekeeper, accused me of stealing silverware," she said. Elena's voice caught. "She said a girl like me was obviously trying to trap the Hale heir. They fired me on the spot." Graydon sank into the chair across from them, his face ashen. "They never told me. I thought you'd changed your mind about writing. They threatened legal action if I ever contacted you." Elena's words came faster now, like a dam breaking. "When I discovered I was pregnant, I was terrified. My mother had just gotten sick. We had no money for lawyers, and your family's reputation." She shook her head. "I convinced myself it was better to stay quiet, to protect Micah from rejection or worse." Micah lifted his head from Elena's shoulder. "Are you mad at Mommy?" he asked Graydon, his voice small but direct. Graydon's expression softened as he looked at the boy. Really looked at him. He saw his own nose, his mother's chin, Elena's gentle eyes. "No, Micah," he said quietly. "I'm not mad at your mommy. I'm sad about all the time we lost. I need time," he continued, running a hand through his hair, "to process this, to figure out what it means. There will need to be." He trailed off, seeing Elena tense. "No lawyers yet," he assured her quickly. "Just Time. Elena nodded, standing with Micah in her arms. Of course. We should go home anyway. The storm's letting up. They gathered their things in silence. Micah's puzzle, Elena's soup pot, their winter coats. At the grand front door, Graydon helped Micah zip his jacket, his hands gentle but uncertain. "Thank you," he said quietly to Elena, "for taking care of him all these years, for making him into such a wonderful boy." Elena's eyes welled with tears. "He makes it easy," she whispered. "He has your kind heart." They stepped out into the gathering dusk, snow crunching beneath their boots. The streetlights were coming back on across the neighborhood, creating pools of warm light in the blue evening. Micah waved back at Graydon, who stood framed in the doorway of his massive estate. Through the frost-etched window, Graydon watched them make their way down his long driveway. Elena's figure was straight and proud despite everything, while Micah hopped from one snowy footprint to another. The huge house felt emptier than ever as their shapes grew smaller in the distance. "Maybe," he murmured to himself, breath fogging the cold glass. "Home isn't a place." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching dust motes in its golden rays. Elena tied her apron with practiced motions, her mind still replaying yesterday's events like a movie she couldn't pause. "So," Ruthie's voice carried across the kitchen. "Word is, you were playing Florence Nightingale up at the Hale mansion." She cracked eggs into a bowl with rapid-fire precision. "Feeding the billionaire, were you?" Heat crept up Elena's neck. He was sick. Nobody should be alone during a storm like that. "Mm-hmm." Ruthie's knowing smile made Elena duck her head and focus on chopping onions. Miss Opal sat at her usual corner booth, newspapers spread before her but dark eyes fixed on Elena. The retired schoolteacher had a way of seeing straight through people, and right now her gaze felt particularly penetrating. "Child," Miss Opal called out, "bring me some more coffee and park yourself for a minute." Elena glanced at Ruthie, who waved her off. "Go on, we're slow this morning anyway." Grabbing the coffee pot, Elena made her way to Miss Opal's booth. The older woman waited until Elena had filled her cup before speaking. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways," Miss Opal said, stirring cream into her coffee. "And sometimes he's about as subtle as a marching band." Elena sank into the opposite seat, smoothing her apron. "Miss Opal, You did right by that man," Miss Opal interrupted. "Showing kindness isn't something to be ashamed of." The morning passed in a blur of orders and familiar routines. Elena kept herself busy, but her thoughts drifted repeatedly to Graydon's face when Micah had spoken those words. The shock, the confusion, the flash of something that might have been hope. When her shift ended, she collected Micah from the church after-school program and headed home to their small duplex. The evening air was crisp, carrying the last bite of winter. Their boots crunched on leftover patches of ice as they climbed the steps to their front door. "Mama, look!" Micah pointed across the street. A familiar black car was pulling up to the curb. Elena's heart skipped as Graydon stepped out, looking more approachable in a simple sweater than his usual suits. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Good evening," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "May I have a word?" Elena nodded, unlocking their door. "Come in. We don't stand on ceremony here." Their living room was warm and lived in, with Micah's artwork decorating the walls and a worn but comfortable couch. Graydon looked almost comically out of place, but he sat when Elena gestured to the couch. "I have a proposition," he said, opening his portfolio. "Business first, if you don't mind." Elena perched on the edge of her armchair while Micah sprawled on the floor with his homework. "I'd like to arrange what we might call supper therapy," Graydon continued. 3 nights a week, you cook dinner at my house. I'll pay you, of course." "I don't want your money," Elena cut in, then flushed at her own directness. Graydon's lips quirked. "I thought you might say that. What if the payment went to the church food pantry instead?" Elena studied him, noting the careful way he held himself, the slight tension in his shoulders. "Why? Because I need to learn," he said simply. "That soup you made, it wasn't just food. It was." He paused, searching for words. "It was care, comfort, things I haven't had in a very long time." Micah looked up from his math worksheet. "Mama makes the best food. She says cooking is like giving hugs with flavors." A genuine smile softened Graydon's features. "She's right about that," Elena twisted her hands in her lap. This was dangerous territory, letting him into their lives even more, creating routines, building expectations. But something in his expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, touched her heart. 3 nights a week, she said slowly. And half the payment goes to the food pantry, half to Miss Ruthie's diner. They're struggling since the plant started layoffs. Graydon nodded, pulling out papers. I took the liberty of drawing up a simple agreement. Nothing formal, just. He cleared his throat. Just so we're clear about expectations. As Elena read through the document, Micah abandoned his homework and edged closer to Graydon. Does this mean we're having dinner with Dad again? The question hung in the air like crystal, fragile and catching light. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Graydon's hands tightened on his portfolio, but his voice was gentle when he answered. Yes, if that's okay with your mother. Elena looked at her son's hopeful face, then at Graydon's careful expression. She picked up the pen he'd brought and signed the agreement with steady hands. When do we start? She asked. The knife trembled in Graydon's hand as he stared at the onion like it was a complex financial report. His pristine kitchen gleamed around them, barely used until now. Elena stood beside him at the marble counter, trying not to smile at his uncertain grip on the knife. Here, Elena said gently. Hold it like this. She adjusted his fingers on the handle. And tuck your other fingers under like a claw. That way you won't cut yourself. Graydon's forehead wrinkled in concentration. I've never actually prepared food before, he admitted, cheeks flushing. The staff always. Everyone starts somewhere, Elena assured him. She demonstrated the chopping motion again. Nice and slow. No rush. Micah sat at the kitchen island, swinging his legs as he colored in a dinosaur picture. The boy glanced up occasionally to watch them with curious eyes. Graydon made his first careful cut. The onion slice was uneven and thick. I'm afraid I'm rather hopeless at this. You run billion-dollar companies? Elena said. I'm sure you can handle an onion. His next few cuts were smoother. As they worked, silence settled between them like a familiar blanket. The steady rhythm of chopping filled the kitchen. Margaret, my wife, Graydon said suddenly, his voice soft. She never cooked either. We always had staff for that. Sometimes I wonder if we missed something important, living that way. Elena stirred the pot of beans simmering on the stove. Tell me about her? She was kind, gentle, but lonely, I think, like me. He set down the knife. We tried for children, but it never happened. When she got sick, he trailed off, staring at nothing. I'm sorry, Elena said quietly. It's been 5 years. Graydon picked up the knife again, his movements mechanical. The house feels very empty sometimes. Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. Single parenting has its lonely moments too. She added spices to the pot. When Micah was a baby, I'd sometimes talk to myself just to hear a grown-up voice. That drew a small smile from Graydon. And now? Now, this little chatterbox keeps me company. Elena ruffled Micah's hair as she passed. Though some nights, after he's asleep. She shrugged. Well, silence can be heavy. Graydon watched her move around his kitchen, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. His eyes followed Micah too, seeing pieces of himself in the boy's serious expression when he concentrated. Is the food almost ready? Micah asked, setting aside his crayons. I'm hungry. Almost, mijo. Elena checked the beans. Why don't you help set the table? Micah hopped down and went to gather plates, comfortable already in Graydon's house. They moved to the dining room, where the long tables seemed to stretch endlessly. Maybe we could eat in the kitchen? Elena suggested, noting Graydon's stiff posture. It's cozier. Relief crossed his face. Yes, that would be nice. Back in the kitchen, they settled around the island. Steam rose from bowls of beans and rice, the chopped onions sprinkled on top. The familiar scents filled the space with warmth. Before anyone could lift a spoon, Micah folded his hands. Can I pray? He asked, looking at both adults. Like we do at home? Graydon blinked in surprise. Of course. Dear God, Micah began, his young voice earnest. Thank you for this food and for helping Mr. Graydon learn to cook. and thank you that we can all eat together. Amen. Amen, Elena echoed softly. She caught Graydon quickly wiping his eyes before he picked up his spoon. They ate together, Micah chattering about school and his latest puzzle. Graydon listened intently, asking questions about Micah's favorite subjects and friends. Elena noticed how he leaned forward slightly, drinking in every detail. When the meal ended, Elena insisted on cleaning up despite Graydon's protests. "You cooked," she reminded him. "Well, you helped cook. That means I clean." "At least let me dry," he said, picking up a towel. They worked side by side at the sink while Micah returned to his coloring. The domesticity of the moment felt both strange and right, like a puzzle piece clicking into place after being lost under the couch. Soon it was time to leave. Elena helped Micah into his coat while Graydon stood awkwardly by the door. "Same time? Thursday?" Elena asked, wrapping her scarf around her neck. "Yes, please." Graydon's voice was quiet but certain. As Elena and Micah walked down the long driveway, she felt Graydon's gaze following them. Glancing back, she caught him standing in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame. The longing in his expression made her heart twist. He looked like a man watching his family walk away, unsure if they'd return. She gave a small wave. He lifted his hand in response, then slowly closed the door as they disappeared into the gathering dusk. Elena stared at the official notice in her mailbox, her heart sinking. The cream-colored envelope bore the Willow Heights Homeowners Association logo, and her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a formal citation for unauthorized vegetation visible from the street. Her beloved tomato plants. The potted plants had been her small piece of joy, carefully tended on her tiny front porch. They reminded her of her grandmother's garden in Mexico, where she'd learned to cook using fresh ingredients. Now they were being called an eyesore. That evening, she tried to hide her worry from Micah as she prepared dinner, but her son noticed her quietness. "Mommy, are you sad?" Micah asked, looking up from his homework at the kitchen table. "No, mi amor." Elena forced a smile. "Just thinking about some grown-up stuff." The HOA hearing was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. Elena had to take time off from the diner, losing precious wages. She wore her best dress, a navy blue cotton number she saved for church, and tried to keep her head high as she walked into the community center. The HOA board members sat behind a long table, their faces stern. Mrs. Peterson, the board president, peered at Elena over her reading glasses. The room felt too warm, too small. "Ms. Cruz." Mrs. Peterson began, her voice clipped. "You were cited for violation of Covenant Section 8.3 regarding visible plantings. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elena's throat felt dry. "They're just tomato plants," she said softly. "In pots. They're well maintained, and my son helps me care for them." "The covenants clearly state that all landscaping must be approved by the board," another member interjected. "We have standards to maintain." "I understand," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But they're not permanent landscaping, they're in containers, and they provide fresh vegetables for my family." Mrs. Peterson's lips thinned. "Rules are rules, Ms. Cruz. We can't make exceptions, or everyone would." The door opened, and footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Elena turned to see Graydon Hale walking in, dressed in an impeccable suit. The board members straightened in their chairs. "Mr. Hale," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone suddenly honeyed. "This is a closed hearing. As a resident and property owner, I believe I have the right to attend," Graydon said calmly. He stood beside Elena's chair. "I'm interested in this matter." "Well, yes, but I've reviewed the covenants," Graydon continued. "Section 8.3 specifically addresses permanent landscaping. Portable container gardens are not explicitly prohibited. In fact, Section 12.1 encourages sustainable living practices." The board members exchanged glances. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his presence, at his quiet defense. "Furthermore," Graydon added, "I've observed Ms. Cruz's plants personally. They're beautifully maintained and add character to our neighborhood. Surely this board has more pressing matters than persecuting tomatoes?" A few members chuckled nervously. Mrs. Peterson's face reddened. "Well, she fumbled. Perhaps we could table this discussion for further review. That seems wise, Graydon agreed. He turned to Elena. Shall we? Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Elena's hands were still shaking. Thank you, she whispered. You didn't have to do that. Graydon looked at her, his eyes gentle. Yes, I did. The next morning, Elena was heading to work when she noticed activity at the Hale estate. Workers were installing a row of large terracotta pots along the estate's stone wall. By afternoon, each pot held a healthy tomato plant, their green leaves bright against the gray stone. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Elena heard whispers at the grocery store, saw pointing fingers as she walked Micah to school. But this time, the whispers didn't sting like before. That evening, she walked across the street to the estate, carrying a plate of fresh cornbread. She found Graydon examining one of the tomato plants, his suit jacket draped over one arm. Your plants look nice, she said softly. He turned, a slight smile on his face. I had help choosing them. The garden center staff was very patient with my questions. You didn't need to do all this. I wanted to. He touched a leaf gently. Besides, I've learned something about growing things lately. Sometimes they need protection to thrive. Elena's eyes stung with tears. Still, after everything with the HOA, I owed you more than this, Graydon said simply, his voice quiet but firm. The wooden steps of First Grace Church creaked under Elena's feet as she climbed them early Thursday morning. The air was crisp, and frost sparkled on the railing. Behind her, Graydon's polished shoes made softer sounds. He seemed to be dragging his feet slightly, like a schoolboy headed to the principal's office. Pastor Danny waited at his office door, coffee pot in hand and a gentle smile on his weathered face. Come in, I've got fresh coffee and those sugar cookies Miss Opal dropped off. The pastor's office felt warm and lived in, with mismatched chairs and family photos covering one wall. Books lined wooden shelves, their spines well worn. A child's crayon drawing of Jesus hung proudly next to his seminary degree. Micah did that last Sunday, Pastor Danny said, noticing Elena's glance at the drawing. He's got quite the artistic touch. Elena sat in one of the cushioned chairs, while Graydon chose the harder wooden seat, his back straight as a ruler. Pastor Danny poured 3 cups of coffee and settled behind his desk, which was really just an old kitchen table. So, he said, looking between them, let's talk about what's weighing on your hearts. Elena's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. We need guidance, she said softly, about Micah, about the truth. Graydon cleared his throat. I've arranged for DNA testing, he said, his business voice slipping through. Discreet, of course. The lab owes me some favors. And you both want this test? Pastor Danny asked, his eyes kind but searching. Elena nodded. We need to know for certain, for Micah's sake, for everyone's sake, Graydon added, then looked down at his hands. I keep thinking about that summer. If I had known. You couldn't have, Elena said quietly. They made sure of that. Pastor Danny leaned forward, elbows on his desk. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. Graydon, what's really frightening you about this? The question hung in the air. Graydon's carefully maintained facade cracked, just slightly. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to be a father. My own was distant, cold. The family name mattered more than family feeling. I see you with Micah, Elena said softly. When you helped him with that puzzle, when you listened to him explain his dinosaur book, that's being a father. But what if I fail? Graydon's voice was barely above a whisper. What if I damage him the way my father? He stopped, pressing his lips together. Pastor Danny nodded slowly. Fear of failure is natural. But remember what Scripture tells us about perfect love casting out fear. Elena, you've raised Micah beautifully on your own. What are you afraid of? Elena's eyes welled up. That this will hurt Micah, that people will talk, that they'll say terrible things about his mother. She wiped at her eyes. I don't care what they say about me, but Micah. Truth has a way of setting things right, Pastor Danny said. Not always quickly, not always easily, but truly. He reached for his Bible. Remember Joseph's story. What others meant for harm, God meant for good. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ms. Opal poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but someone's asking for his mama." Micah bounded in, fresh from Sunday school, his hands covered in glitter glue. "Look what I made!" He held up a sparkly cross. "And Miss Sarah says I'm the best at memory verses." The tension in the room dissolved as Micah climbed into Elena's lap, then reached over to show Graydon his artwork. "See? The glitter is like God's light." Graydon's face softened as he examined the cross. "It's excellent craftsmanship," he said seriously, making Micah beam. "We should probably go," Elena said, standing with Micah in her arms. "Thank you, Pastor Danny. Remember," the pastor said, walking them to the door, "my office is always open, and so is the one who holds all our tomorrows." They stepped out into the church hallway, where morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, painting the floor in pools of color. Micah wiggled down from Elena's arms and, without hesitation, slipped his small hand into Graydon's larger one. "I'm not scared," Micah whispered, looking up at Graydon with complete trust. The bell above Ruthie's diner chimed at exactly 5:30 a.m. as Graydon Hale pushed through the door, dressed in what he probably thought was casual clothing, pressed khakis, and a sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on his uncertain face. Ruthie Blake stood behind the counter, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "Well, look who decided to join the working class." Her voice held a mix of amusement and skepticism. "I want to learn," Graydon said simply, pulling out a small notebook. "Real breakfast. Not the kind my chef makes." Ruthie's laugh echoed through the empty diner. "Honey, you better roll up those fancy sleeves. First lesson is cleaning the griddle." For the next hour, Graydon followed Ruthie's instructions with the focused intensity he usually reserved for board meetings. He scrubbed the griddle, filled salt shakers, and learned the proper way to stack coffee cups. His hands, soft from years of office work, turned red from hot water and cleaning solution. The morning rush began at 6:45. Regular customers did double takes seeing the town's billionaire wearing a Ruthie's diner apron, flour dusting his dark hair. Elena arrived for her shift, Micah in tow before school, and nearly dropped her purse at the sight. "Mr. Hale?" Micah's eyes went wide. "Are you making breakfast?" "Trying to," Graydon admitted, staring at the egg he'd just broken. The yolk had split, spreading across the griddle in a messy yellow pool. Though not very successfully, Ruthie hip-checked him aside. "Watch and learn, rich boy, quick wrist flick, like this." She demonstrated with perfect form, the egg crack clean and precise. The morning progressed with Graydon's education. He burned 3 orders of toast, oversalted a batch of home fries, and somehow managed to get pancake batter in his hair. But he kept at it, his determination evident in the set of his jaw and the careful way he watched Elena and Ruthie work. The regular breakfast crowd filtered in, including the Saturday morning veterans group that had been meeting at Ruthie's for decades. They occupied their usual corner booth, watching the spectacle with undisguised interest. "Hey, Hale!" called out Jim Porter, his Vietnam War veteran's cap slightly crooked. "That bacon looks a little crispy from here." Graydon turned, holding his spatula like a foreign object. "More than a little, I'm afraid. Would you like me to start fresh?" "Nah," Jim grinned, revealing a gap where his front tooth should be. "Some of us like it burnt. Reminds us of mess hall cooking. Why don't you bring it over yourself?" Elena watched as Graydon carried the plate to their table, noting how the veterans made space for him to sit. Their conversation shifted from their usual topics to questions about Graydon's business experience and thoughts on local employment. "Plant's been here since before the war," explained Frank Martinez, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "My daddy worked there. My brother too before he shipped out. Never came back." Graydon listened, really listened, his notebook forgotten on the counter. The veterans shared stories of the town's history, its struggles, and its resilience. They didn't ask for anything, but their pride in their community was evident in every word. "You should join us next Saturday," Jim suggested, as Graydon stood to return to his cooking lessons. "We could use some fresh perspectives in our coffee debates." "I'd be honored," Graydon replied, and Elena could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. As the morning wore on, Other customers began engaging with Graydon too. Mrs. Peterson taught him her secret to fluffy scrambled eggs. Tommy from the hardware store shared tips about the best local honey for the biscuits. Even grumpy old Mr. Dashin Henderson cracked a smile when Graydon presented him with a perfectly cooked, sunny-side-up egg, his 5th attempt. Ruthie watched it all with knowing eyes, occasionally catching Elena's glance and giving her a subtle wink. The diner hummed with its usual breakfast energy, but there was something different in the air. The invisible wall between the Hale estate and the town seemed to be crumbling, one burnt piece of toast at a time. By closing time, Graydon's apron was a disaster of cooking attempts, but his face showed a contentment Elena had never seen before. He helped with the cleanup, learning the proper way to break down the stations and prep for tomorrow. "Not bad for your first day," Ruthie admitted, hanging up her apron. "Though maybe stick to the simpler stuff next time. Those French toast experiments of yours nearly set off the smoke alarm." "Next time?" Graydon asked hopefully. "Oh, Lord." Ruthie rolled her eyes, but her smile was genuine. "Yes, next time. But bring better shoes. Those Italian leather things won't survive another shift on these floors." As Elena gathered her things and collected Micah from the booth where he'd been doing homework, Graydon wrapped several stacks of pancakes in foil. "For tomorrow's breakfast," he explained, then added sheepishly, "These are from Ruthie's batch, not mine." The three of them stepped out into the cool evening air, Graydon insisting on carrying both the pancake package and Micah's backpack. They walked slowly, Micah bouncing between them, chattering about his math test and how he'd watched Graydon cook through the service window. "Did you see when Dad flipped that pancake and it stuck to the ceiling?" Micah giggled, the word Dad slipping out naturally now. Elena noticed Graydon's step falter slightly at the word, but his smile grew wider. The town felt different around them. People waved as they passed. Old Mrs. Wilson called out from her porch about joining her church fundraiser committee. The teenager at the corner store, who usually watched Elena with suspicious eyes, smiled and waved. The manila envelope sat in the center of Elena's kitchen table like a ticking clock. Its crisp edges and official letterhead seemed to mock their nervousness. Elena's hands trembled as she poured 3 mugs of hot chocolate, while Micah swung his legs back and forth on his chair, humming quietly to himself. Graydon sat stiffly, his usual confident posture replaced by an anxious rigidity. He kept straightening his tie, though he'd already loosened it twice. The kitchen's warm yellow walls and the smell of fresh-baked cookies couldn't quite ease the tension in the air. "Can I open it?" Micah asked, reaching for the envelope. His small fingers brushed against the paper before Elena gently caught his hand. "Let's all do it together, Maijo," Elena said softly. She glanced at Graydon, who gave a short nod. Elena picked up the envelope, its weight somehow both too heavy and too light for something that could change their lives forever. She slid her finger under the flap, the tearing sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. The papers inside were stark white, covered in medical terminology and numbers. Graydon leaned forward, his shoulders tense. "Would you like me to?" he offered, extending his hand. Elena shook her head and unfolded the papers. Her eyes scanned the text, searching for the one line that mattered most. When she found it, her breath caught in her throat. "Probability of paternity, 99.99%, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen fell silent. Micah looked between the two adults, his brown eyes wide with anticipation. "What does that mean?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. Graydon's face transformed. The careful mask he usually wore cracked, revealing raw emotion underneath. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned to Micah. "It means," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "that you're my son. I'm your father." Micah's face lit up like a sunrise. Without hesitation, he launched himself from his chair into Graydon's arms. "I knew it. I knew you were my daddy." Graydon caught him, holding him close, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. His expensive suit wrinkled as Micah wrapped his arms around his neck, but for once, Graydon didn't seem to care about appearances. Elena watched them through her own tears, her heart so full it ached. Years of carrying this secret alone, of wondering if she'd made the right choices, seemed to lift from her shoulders. "Can we build something together?" Micah asked, pulling back to look at Graydon's face. "I have my Legos." Graydon laughed, a sound of pure joy that Elena had never heard from him before. "Of course we can, son," he said, testing the word on his tongue like a precious gift. Micah scrambled down and ran to his room, returning moments later with his biggest Lego set, a stadium he'd been saving for a special occasion. He dumped the pieces onto the kitchen table, plastic blocks clattering against the wood. "I've never actually built anything with Legos before," Graydon admitted, picking up a piece and examining it with genuine curiosity. "That's okay, Daddy," Micah said, the word flowing naturally from his lips. "I'll teach you. First, we need to sort the pieces by color." Elena moved around the kitchen, putting away dishes and wiping down counters, but her attention never strayed far from the scene before her. Graydon, who usually commanded boardrooms with authority, now sat patiently following the instructions of an 8-year-old boy. His tie was completely loose now, his sleeves rolled up as he helped separate red pieces from blue ones. The evening passed in a blur of plastic bricks and quiet conversation. Micah chattered about his favorite sports teams, explaining to Graydon why this stadium needed special sections for hot dog vendors and a special box for the team mascot. Graydon absorbed every word, asking questions and offering suggestions with the same serious attention he might give to a business proposal. As the stadium took shape, Elena noticed the way Graydon's hands became more confident with the tiny pieces, how his posture relaxed, how his smile came more easily. The wall of formality he usually maintained had crumbled completely in the face of his son's uninhibited affection. The kitchen grew dark outside the windows, but none of them wanted to break the spell of this moment. Elena turned on the overhead light, its warm glow creating a cozy bubble around their little family. Finally, Micah placed the last flag on top of the stadium. "Done," he announced proudly. "Look, Mom, we built it together." Elena came closer to admire their work. The stadium was a colorful masterpiece of creativity, with uneven walls and a slightly lopsided scoreboard that made it perfect in its imperfection. "It's beautiful, my Joe," she said, resting her hand on his shoulder. Micah yawned, the excitement of the day catching up with him. Graydon checked his watch, surprised to see how late it had gotten. "Time for bed, I think," he said gently. As Elena started to guide Micah toward his bedroom, Graydon reached out and caught the boy's hand. Kneeling down to eye level, he pulled Micah into another hug. "Thank you for teaching me about Legos," he said. Then, in a whisper that carried clearly in the quiet kitchen, "We'll do this right." The church hall buzzed with activity as people streamed in carrying steaming dishes and covered platters. Cheerful voices echoed off the high ceiling while volunteers arranged long tables in neat rows. Colorful paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. Elena stood at her usual spot in the church kitchen, stirring a massive pot of caldo de pollo. The familiar aroma of herbs and chicken filled the air, mingling with the scents of dozens of other home-cooked dishes. She watched through the serving window as Graydon moved through the hall, greeting everyone with a warmth that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "That man's changed more than autumn leaves," Miss Opal remarked, sliding another tray of her famous tea cakes into the oven. She adjusted her flowered apron and smiled. "And I do believe you had something to do with it, child." Elena felt her cheeks warm. "He did it himself. He just needed a chance to belong somewhere." "Mm-hmm," Miss Opal hummed knowingly, her eyes twinkling. "And a family to belong to." Before Elena could respond, Micah burst into the kitchen, his dress shirt already untucked. "Mom, the tables are almost full. Can I help serve?" His eyes shone with excitement. "First, tuck her in that shirt," Elena laughed, reaching to straighten his collar. "Then you can help carry the bread baskets." The hall filled quickly as more townspeople arrived. Veterans from the Saturday coffee group sat near the front, trading jokes with Graydon like old friends. Ruthie from the diner chatted with church ladies while arranging her famous cornbread. Even Tessa Burrows appeared, carrying a carefully prepared casserole and looking slightly uncertain. As Elena carried out her pot of caldo, she caught glimpses of the transformation around her. Plant workers sat beside business owners, elderly couples welcomed young families, and children darted between tables with paper planes. The divisions that had long marked Willow Bend seemed to blur under the glow of the lanterns. Graydon stood near the front, his usual suit replaced by khakis and a sweater. He looked more at ease than Elena had ever seen him, helping an elderly woman with her chair and ruffling Micah's hair as the boy proudly arranged bread baskets. When most people had settled with full plates, Graydon cleared his throat and tapped his glass. The happy chatter gradually quieted as faces turned toward him. "I've given many speeches in boardrooms," he began, his voice warm but slightly nervous. "But nothing quite like this. You see, for years, I thought success meant bigger houses and fuller bank accounts." He paused, his eyes finding Elena's. "I was wrong." The hall remained silent, caught by the sincerity in his words. "A few months ago, during the ice storm, I learned what real wealth looks like. It looks like a neighbor bringing soup when you're sick, like veterans sharing coffee and wisdom on Saturday mornings, like Ms. Opal's tea cakes that somehow make every problem seem smaller." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Ms. Opal dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "This community has taught me what home truly tastes like," Graydon continued. "It tastes like Elena's caldo de pollo." He smiled at her. "Like Ruthie's breakfast special, like every dish on these tables tonight, made with love and shared with grace." Micah suddenly jumped up from his seat, unable to contain himself. "That's my dad," he announced proudly to everyone, and no one in particular. A wave of touched laughter swept the room. Graydon's voice grew thick with emotion. "Yes, I am. And that's the greatest gift this community has given me. The chance to be Micah's father, to be Elena's." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Friend, and to be your neighbor." Elena noticed Tessa wiping her eyes discreetly with a napkin. The woman who had once been so quick to judge now sat with shoulders relaxed, defenses down. "So thank you," Graydon concluded, raising his glass. "Thank you for teaching me that the finest things in life aren't found in mansions or boardrooms, but right here, at tables like these, with people like you." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. The lanterns swayed gently overhead, casting dancing shadows as laughter and conversation resumed with renewed warmth. Children ran between tables, paper planes soared through the air, and the sound of joy echoed off the church walls. Elena watched as Graydon was surrounded by well-wishers, his smile genuine and relaxed. Micah darted between guests, proudly introducing "my dad" to anyone who would listen. Ms. Opal distributed tea cakes with knowing smiles, and even Tessa joined a table of church ladies, her usual reserve melting into real conversation. The hall glowed with more than just lantern light. It shone with the warmth of community, of barriers breaking down, of home being built one shared meal at a time. As Elena moved through the crowd with a fresh pot of caldo, she felt the truth of Graydon's words in every smile, every laugh, every "thank you" passed across the tables. The evening flowed on, lit by lanterns and warmed by fellowship, as Willow Bend's people discovered what it meant to truly be neighbors. Laughter echoed through the church hall, rising up to the rafters like a joyful prayer of thanksgiving. The church hall had settled into a comfortable hum of conversation as people finished their meals. Graydon stood at the front, his usual polished demeanor softened by the evening's warmth. He cleared his throat, and the room gradually quieted. "Before dessert," he began, his voice carrying across the hall, "I'd like to share something important with you all." He pulled out some folded papers from his jacket pocket. "As many of you know, there's been talk about closing the textile plant." A heavy silence fell over the room. Elena watched faces around her grow tense. She knew how many families depended on those jobs. "But I believe there's a better way," Graydon continued. He unfolded a large sketch and held it up. "This is a proposal to convert part of the plant into something new, something that could help our whole community." He walked between the tables, showing detailed drawings of modern buildings and garden spaces. "We're calling it the Not a Place Project. Instead of shutting down, we'll retool one section to produce modular homes. Affordable ones, built right here by the same skilled hands that have kept our plant running for generations." Ms. Opal leaned forward in her chair, adjusting her glasses. "Modular homes? Yes?" Graydon smiled. Quality houses built in sections at the plant, then assembled on site. But that's just the beginning. We're also creating a training program. Anyone who wants to learn construction or manufacturing skills will have that chance. Elena watched Micah's eyes light up as Graydon explained how the homes would work. Her son was perched on the edge of his seat, completely captivated. The Hale Foundation will fund the initial conversion, Graydon continued. But this isn't just about buildings. Each neighborhood will have community spaces, gardens, gathering areas, and something especially important. He paused, his eyes finding Elena's. Community kitchens, where neighbors can cook together and share meals, just like we're doing tonight. Old Joe, who'd worked at the plant for 30 years, stood up slowly. You mean we're not losing our jobs? No, sir, Graydon replied firmly. In fact, we'll need more workers as the program grows. This town built my family's company. It's time we returned that investment. Tears welled in Margaret Weber's eyes. Her husband had worked maintenance at the plant for 20 years. My Tommy was so worried, she whispered. We thought we'd have to leave. The room erupted in excited chatter. Elena saw hope blooming on faces that had been drawn with worry for months. Ruthie was already talking about cooking classes in the new kitchens. Pastor Danny beamed from his seat, nodding proudly. Graydon held up his hands for quiet. There's more. Each development will include senior housing units, so our elderly neighbors can stay close to family. And we're partnering with local churches to ensure everyone who needs a home can afford one. Ms. Opal's voice rang out clear and strong. Well, glory be. That's what I call putting faith into action. People began standing, applauding. Some wiped tears, others hugged. Micah tugged at Elena's sleeve. Mom, can we live in one of the new houses? Before she could answer, Tessa approached their table. Elena, she said softly, would you consider heading up the community kitchen program? We'll need someone who knows how to bring people together through food. Elena blinked in surprise. I'd be honored. As the crowd broke into smaller groups discussing plans, Elena slipped into the kitchen to start cleanup. She filled the industrial sink with hot water, letting the familiar routine calm her overwhelming emotions. The kitchen door swung open, and Graydon entered carrying a stack of plates. Need some help? You don't have to, Elena said. You should be out there talking to people about the project. They're doing fine without me. He rolled up his sleeves and joined her at the sink. Besides, I've learned that some of the best conversations happen over dish duty. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot water. You know, she said finally, what you're doing for this town, it's amazing. Graydon focused on scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot. I should have done it years ago. All that money sitting in accounts while people struggled? What was I thinking? You're doing it now. That's what matters. Elena handed him a towel. Their fingers touched, lingering for a moment. And you're not just throwing money at the problem. You're building something that will last. Through the kitchen window they could see people leaving the church, walking together in the evening light, gesturing animatedly as they talked about the future. Micah's laugh carried from where he played with other children near the dessert table. I learned that from you, Graydon said quietly, drying another plate. How to make something lasting, something real. Their hands met again over a serving bowl, and this time neither pulled away immediately. The warm water dripped between their fingers as they stood in the peaceful kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of community and hope. Elena's phone buzzed repeatedly on her nightstand, jolting her awake. Through bleary eyes, she saw dozens of missed calls and messages. Her heart sank when she opened the first text from Ruthie, "Turn on the news, now." With trembling fingers, Elena grabbed her tablet. The headline hit her like a physical blow. Gold Digger Entraps Billionaire. Secret Love Child Scandal Rocks Hale Foundation. Her photo, taken without her knowledge, showed her leaving the church kitchen. Below it, an older picture from her days as a maid at the coastal estate. The article was brutal. It painted her as a calculating schemer who had seduced Graydon years ago, hidden his child, and now conveniently reappeared when his wealth was at its peak. every detail twisted to make her look manipulative. Even the soup she'd brought during the storm was described as quote, a calculated move to infiltrate the Hale estate. Micah's sleepy voice came from the doorway. "Mommy, why is your phone making so much noise?" Elena quickly shut off the tablet. "It's nothing, my amor, just some work stuff." She forced a smile. "Let's get ready for school." But as they stepped outside, camera flashes exploded from the street. Reporters shouted questions. "Miss Cruz, how long did you plan this? Was it always about the money?" Elena grabbed Micah's hand and rushed him back inside, her chest tight with panic. She called the school, telling them Micah would be absent, then phoned Ruthie. "They're at the diner, too," Ruthie said, her voice tight with anger. "Some customers walked out when they saw the news." That snake, Campbell Pierce, is quoted all through the article, talking about protecting the foundation's integrity and suggesting an investigation into your past. Elena sank onto her couch, feeling sick. How did they get the DNA results? Those were private. "Someone leaked them." "Three guesses who," Ruthie growled. "Have you heard from Graydon?" "His secretary called. He's in emergency board meetings all day." Elena's voice cracked. "He said he'll fix it." A knock at the door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw two official-looking women with badges. Her stomach dropped. "Ms. Cruz, this is Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you regarding a complaint about Micah's living situation." Elena's hands shook as she opened the door. The women's faces were professionally neutral as they explained. An anonymous tip had raised concerns about custody instability and potential exploitation of a minor. For 2 excruciating hours, they inspected her home, questioned her about Micah's routine, and reviewed her employment history. Though they were polite, their presence felt like an accusation. Micah watched from his room, confused and frightened. After they left, Elena called Ms. Opal, who arrived within minutes, bearing tea and quiet strength. "Child, let it out," she said, holding Elena as she finally broke down. "I knew people might talk," Elena sobbed. "But this? They're making me sound like some kind of... And now, CPS? Micah's scared. The diner's suffering. Everything I've built." Ms. Opal stroked her hair. "The truth will stand, Elena, no matter how many lies they pile on top of it." Elena's phone rang. Graydon's number. He sounded stressed, distracted. "Elena, I'm so sorry. The board's threatening to remove me as chair." Campbell's rallied support against me, claiming emotional instability. "I have to handle this carefully." "Carefully?" Elena's voice shook. "They're destroying my reputation. They sent CPS to investigate me." Micah's terrified. I know. Trust me. I'm working on it. I have lawyers reviewing options. Just lay low for now. Don't talk to anyone. I'll call tonight once I have a plan." The call ended too quickly, leaving Elena feeling hollow. She spent the day fielding worried calls from church friends, blocking reporters' numbers, and trying to explain to Micah why they couldn't go outside. As evening fell, she kept checking her phone. Graydon had promised to call. She made dinner, helped Micah with homework, tucked him in. Still, no call. She sat in her darkened living room, watching lights go out across town, including the Hale estate. 10 o'clock passed. Then 11. The call never came. Elena stared at her silent phone, feeling the familiar ache of abandonment creep back in. It was happening again, just like that summer years ago, when she'd been cast aside to protect the Hale family's reputation. Only this time, she wasn't just a young maid. She was a mother watching her son's world shake. A text from Ruthie lit up her screen. "You okay?" Elena typed back with trembling fingers. "He didn't call." The 3 dots appeared as Ruthie typed, then stopped, then started again. Finally, "Come stay with me tomorrow. We'll face this together." Elena curled up on her couch, wrapping herself in the blanket Micah had made at Sunday school. Across the street, the Hale estate stood dark and silent, as unreachable as it had been that first night in the storm. But now the silence felt different. Not like illness or loneliness, but like choice, like withdrawal. The tears came quietly as midnight approached. Her phone remained dark, And with each passing minute, the warmth they'd built over shared meals and gentle hopes grew colder, replaced by the harsh glare of headlines and the echoing silence of an unanswered phone. Graydon sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of legal papers and board reports. The morning light cast long shadows across the marble floors, making the mansion feel colder than ever. Campbell Pierce paced before him, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood. "The board wants answers, Graydon," Campbell said, his voice sharp with barely contained frustration. "This situation, with the maid and her son, it's destroying everything we've built." Graydon's phone vibrated again on his desk. Elena's name flashed across the screen for the 5th time that morning. He turned it face down, his hand trembling slightly. "She's not just a maid," Graydon muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The weight of the Foundation's legacy pressed down on him like a physical thing. Campbell seized on his hesitation. "Think about your mother's vision, the philanthropic commitments. The plant conversion project will tank if we don't contain this scandal." He dropped a stack of newspapers on Graydon's desk. "The press is having a field day." Graydon's eyes caught the headlines. "Hail here scandal. Billionaire trapped by secret love child." His stomach churned. "Sign these." Campbell pushed forward a thick document. "Step down temporarily. Let us handle the narrative." As Graydon reached for his reading glasses, something colorful caught his eye beneath the mess of papers. He pulled out a slightly crumpled drawing done in bright crayons. Micah had left it behind after their last dinner together. The picture showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a simple house. Above them, written in wobbly letters, "Home." In the corner, Micah had carefully printed, "For Dad." Graydon's throat tightened. He remembered Micah's proud grin as he'd presented the drawing, Elena's warm laugh as she'd hung it on the refrigerator. Now the kitchen would be empty, the laughter gone. Across town in the church kitchen, Elena methodically chopped onions, though she couldn't blame the vegetables for all her tears. The familiar rhythm of cooking was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking. Steam rose from huge pots of soup meant for the evening's community dinner. "Child, you don't have to be here today," Ms. Opal said softly from the doorway. "Not with everything." "I need to be here," Elena whispered, wiping her cheeks with her sleeve. "The soup kitchen doesn't stop because my heart's breaking." She'd seen the reporters outside her duplex that morning, heard the whispers at the grocery store, felt the stares that followed her and Micah. She'd sent him to school with a brave smile, but her son's confused eyes haunted her. "He hasn't called," Elena admitted, her voice cracking. "Not once since the story broke. Just like before, just disappears when things get hard." She stirred the pot with more force than necessary, splashing broth onto the stovetop. Back in his study, Graydon stood at the window, Campbell's voice fading to background noise. The evening was settling in, and lights were coming on across town. He could see the church steeple from here, imagining Elena in the kitchen below it. His chest ached. He wandered out into the hallway, footsteps echoing. The house felt vast and empty, like a museum after hours. No puzzles scattered on the floor. No smell of home cooking. No child's laughter bouncing off the walls. In the kitchen, he touched the spot where Elena had stood teaching him to chop vegetables, patient with his clumsy attempts. The refrigerator door was bare where Micah's artwork had been. Every room held ghosts of moments he'd taken for granted. Graydon sank into an armchair, Micah's drawing clutched in his hand. The stick figures smiled up at him, mocking his cowardice. He thought of Elena waiting for his call, of Micah facing playground whispers alone. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty halls. His words echoed back, offering no answers, while outside his window the lights of his true home burned without him. The drawing trembled in his hands as the magnitude of his mistake crashed over him. He had traded warmth for walls, love for legacy, family for fear. The mansion's silence pressed in, as cold and unforgiving as the headlines scattered across his desk. The church kitchen hummed with familiar sounds, the gentle bubbling of soup, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the soft whir of the industrial fan. Elena worked methodically, her hands moving through the motions she knew by heart. Steam rose from multiple pots on the stovetop, carrying the comforting aroma of chicken and herbs through the air. Ms. Opal sat at the prep table, her weathered hands efficiently peeling potatoes. Her presence was steady, like a lighthouse in a storm. She hadn't said much since Elena arrived hours ago, just pulled up a chair and got to work. Micah sat cross-legged in the corner, homework spread across a small folding table. His pencil tapped against his math book, but his eyes kept drifting to the kitchen door. The sound made Elena's heart ache. "Mama?" Micah's voice was small, uncertain. "Did Mr. Graydon— did Dad leave like before?" Elena's knife paused mid-chop. She set it down carefully, wiping her hands on her apron before turning to face her son. His eyes were wide with worry, reminding her so much of herself at his age. "Oh, honey," she said, crossing to kneel beside him. "This is different. He's just very busy right now with some work problems." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her heart. The silence from the mansion felt heavy, familiar, like all those years ago when her letters went unanswered. "But he promised," Micah insisted, lower lip trembling slightly. "He said we'd do it right this time." Ms. Opal's potato peeler clinked against the metal bowl. "Child," she said, her voice warm but firm, "sometimes grown folks get scared and forget their promises for a minute. Doesn't mean they won't remember them again." Elena stood, smoothing Micah's hair. "Why don't you finish that math, and then we'll make some hot chocolate?" She forced a smile, but her son was too perceptive. "You're worried too," he said simply. Before Elena could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Pastor Danny poked his head in, his kind face creased with concern. "Elena, there are some reporters outside again. I've asked them to leave, but I'll use the back door when we go home," Elena said quickly, turning back to her cooking. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the soup. Ms. Opal set down her peeler with a decisive clack. "Elena Cruz," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. "Come sit down a minute. The soup will burn, child. I've been cooking longer than you've been alive. Sit." Elena reluctantly pulled up a chair. Pastor Danny quietly closed the door, leaving them in their bubble of warmth and steam. "Now listen here, Mrs.", Opal said, taking Elena's restless hands in her own. "Truth whispered into a storm is still truth. Don't you let their noise drown out what you know in your heart." "But what if," Elena's voice caught, "what if I was wrong to hope? To let Micah hope?" "Mama's crying," Micah whispered, abandoning his homework to wrap his arms around her waist. "Just tired, baby," Elena assured him, but the tears kept falling. All the fear and hurt she'd been holding back spilled over. Ms. Opal reached across the table and lifted Elena's chin. "You listen to me now. That man up in that big empty house? He's scared. Scared of losing his comfortable loneliness. Scared of loving and being loved. But fear ain't stronger than truth. And the truth is, you three are family. The papers say—" "Papers," Ms. Opal scoffed. "I've seen you three together. Seen how that man lights up when Micah walks in a room. Seen how he watches you when you're cooking, like he's finally found something real in all his wealth. That's the truth, Elena. The rest is just noise in the storm." Elena wiped her eyes with her apron. "But he hasn't called. Not once since the news broke." "Then you keep cooking," Ms. Opal said firmly. "You keep feeding people who need it. You keep loving that boy of yours. And you keep standing in your truth, quiet and steady as a lighthouse. Sometimes folks need a light to find their way home." Micah tugged at Elena's sleeve. "Can I help cook? Like we did with Dad?" The simple question hit Elena like a physical ache, but she managed a real smile this time. "Of course, baby. Want to help me chop carrots?" They worked together as the evening deepened into night. Ms. Opal told stories about the town's history, about other storms that had come and gone. Pastor Danny brought them coffee and sat listening, adding his own quiet words of encouragement. Gradually, the kitchen filled with containers of soup and fresh bread. Elena packed some for the shelter, some for homebound church members, some for anyone who might need it. Her eyes grew heavy, but her hands kept moving. "Elena," Ms. Opal said gently, "it's past midnight. Just one more batch," Elena murmured. but her words slurred with exhaustion. She sat heavily in a chair, meaning to rest just a moment. Micah was already asleep on the small couch in the corner, covered with Miss Opal's cardigan. The kitchen was warm and quiet, filled with the familiar sense of home and comfort. Elena's head drooped, her apron still dusted with flour, and sleep finally claimed her at the old wooden table. Miss Opal quietly covered her with a spare tablecloth, then sat back down to keep watch through the night. Outside, the reporters had gone, leaving only the soft sound of rain against the windows. The storm continued, but inside the church kitchen, peace settled like a blessing over the sleeping family. Footsteps echoed through the vast marble halls of the Hale estate, each step a hollow reminder of emptiness. Graydon's shoes clicked against the polished floor as he wandered from room to room, his shadow stretching long in the dim evening light. The mansion felt colder than ever, despite the heating system humming steadily. In the living room, his eyes fixed on the spot where Micah's puzzle pieces had been scattered just days ago. Now the floor was spotless, pristine, and utterly lifeless. The kitchen counter, where Elena had first set that life-changing pot of soup, stood bare and gleaming. Even the lingering scent of her cooking had faded. He paused by the piano, running his fingers along its dusty surface. The photograph that had sparked Elena's recognition still sat there, but now it seemed to mock him. His mother's coastal estate loomed in the image, as cold and imposing as this place. "What would you think now, Mother?" he whispered to the empty room. "Your son, the failure." Again. Making his way to his study, Graydon's gaze fell on Micah's crayon drawing, propped against his computer screen where he'd left it. The paper was slightly crumpled from his constant handling, the colors bright and hopeful. A simple house, with a red door, 3 stick figures holding hands outside. Above them, in careful child's writing, "Home." Graydon picked up the drawing, his hands trembling slightly. Micah had drawn him taller than he really was, with a huge smile that stretched across his face. Elena stood next to him, holding both their hands, her stick-figure hair colored with careful brown strokes. The weight of his silence crashed over him. How many hours had passed since he'd promised to call? How many times had Micah asked Elena if his dad would come back? The word "dad" caught in his throat. He'd wanted it so badly, and when he finally had it, he'd hidden behind board meetings and legal papers. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he scrolled through his contacts. Past Campbell's missed calls, past his lawyer's urgent messages, until he found Pastor Danny's number. His finger hovered over it for a long moment before he pressed "call." The pastor answered on the second ring. "Graydon? I've been praying you'd call." "I've made a mess of everything," Graydon said, his voice rough. He sank into his leather chair, still clutching Micah's drawing. "I don't know how to fix it." "Tell me what's in your heart, son." Pastor Danny's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "I'm scared." The words tumbled out before Graydon could stop them. "I thought I could protect them by handling the board first, by controlling the story, but I just proved everyone right, that I'm no different from my parents, that money matters more than people." Pastor Danny was quiet for a moment. "You know, I remember when we first got that industrial stove for the church kitchen. Top of the line, all the bells and whistles. But you know what made it a real kitchen? What? The people who gathered around it, the hands that chopped vegetables, the voices that shared stories, the hearts that offered prayers over simple soup." Pastor Danny's voice grew warmer. "Home isn't built with marble, son. It's built with chairs around a table." Graydon looked around his study, taking in the expensive art, the rare books, the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. None of it had ever made him feel at home. "I can still see them, leaving that first night," Graydon said softly. "Elena and Micah, walking through the snow. I watched until they disappeared, and I thought maybe home wasn't a place. But I was wrong, wasn't I? It's not the place, it's the courage to stay when things get hard." "Now you're getting it," Pastor Danny said. "You know, Elena's still at the church kitchen. She cooks when she's hurting, just like someone else I know works when he's afraid." Graydon's eyes drifted to his laptop screen, filled with emails from Campbell and the board. Legal threats, pressure to step down, warnings about scandal. He'd been staring at them for hours, trying to find the right words to salvage his position. "The board meeting's tomorrow," he said. "They want me to publicly deny everything, to protect the foundation's reputation. They're prepared to remove me if I don't. And what does your heart tell you matters more? Their approval or your family?" Family. The word rang in Graydon's ears. He looked at Micah's drawing again, at those simple stick figures holding hands, at the home his son had imagined for them all. "I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of the Hale name," Graydon said. "But maybe it's time to be worthy of a different name, Dad." "Now that," Pastor Danny said warmly, "sounds like a prayer worth answering." Graydon sat up straighter in his chair. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his laptop. The screen glowed with Campbell's latest email, full of threats and ultimatums. His cursor hovered over the reply button. Instead, he closed the laptop with a decisive click. Determination hardened in his eyes as he carefully folded Micah's drawing and tucked it into his jacket pocket close to his heart. The grand conference room of the Willow Bend Community Church buzzed with tension. Emergency board meetings usually happened in gleaming corporate offices, not church fellowship halls with metal folding chairs and children's artwork on the walls. But the ice storm had knocked out power at the Hale Foundation headquarters, forcing them here. Campbell Pierce stood at the front, his tailored suit, a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. His polished smile didn't reach his eyes as he addressed the board members and executives who'd braved the weather. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Campbell said, his voice smooth as silk. "Recent events have made it clear that Mr. Hale's judgment has become compromised. The foundation's reputation." The double doors swung open. Graydon Hale strode in, laptop under his arm. His tie was slightly crooked, and his usually perfect hair showed signs of the wind outside. But his eyes blazed with purpose. "Before you continue, Campbell," Graydon said, setting up his laptop, "you should know this meeting is being live-streamed to the community." Murmurs rippled through the room. Campbell's smile flickered. "Really, Graydon? This is a private board matter." "Not anymore," Graydon typed quickly, and the church's projection screen lit up with the live feed. "Since we're in a house of worship, let's have some truth." He turned to face the board members directly. Campbell leaked confidential DNA results to the press. He orchestrated a smear campaign against Elena Cruz and her son, my son. He made an anonymous call to Child Protective Services. "These accusations are absurd," Campbell sputtered, his composure cracking. "I was protecting the foundation's interests from a woman clearly after your money. Elena Cruz," Graydon's voice cut through the room like steel, "works 2 jobs to support our son. She runs the church's food ministry. When I was sick during the ice storm, she brought soup to a stranger. She taught me how to chop onions and say grace." He walked to the center of the room, addressing both the board and the camera. "I've spent years signing checks from climate-controlled offices, thinking that was enough. But this town showed me what real philanthropy looks like. It's Ms. Opal making extra tea cakes for hungry kids. It's Ruthie keeping the diner open late so third-shift workers can get hot meals. It's Elena feeding anyone who walks into that kitchen, no questions asked." Campbell moved to cut the live stream, but Pastor Danny stepped forward from the shadows. "This is God's house, Mr. Pierce. Truth speaks here." Graydon nodded thanks. "I hereby decline re-election as foundation chair." Gasps filled the room. "Furthermore, I'm moving the endowment's headquarters to Willow Bend. New bylaws will require half the board seats be filled by community members. All meetings will be open door." "You can't do this," Campbell protested. "The bylaws—" "Actually, I can. As majority shareholder, I just did." Graydon's voice softened. "You taught me well, Campbell, how to manage image, how to control narrative, how to keep the right people in power. But I don't want that legacy anymore." He closed his laptop, tucking it under his arm. "I choose a different inheritance, one measured in soup pots and puzzle pieces, in tomato plants and prayer cards, in a little boy who deserves a father brave enough to stand up for what's right." Graydon walked to the door, then turned back one last time. "The vote's on the table, but I won't be here for it. There's somewhere else I need to be." He stepped into the hallway, the sound of chaos erupting behind him. His feet carried him toward the familiar warmth of the church kitchen, where the real work of healing a community happened one meal at a time. Through the kitchen windows, lights twinkled across town despite the storm. Not the cold glitter of wealth, but the warm glow of neighbors, looking out for each other. Of hope, rekindled. Of home. Steam rose from enormous pots as Elena stirred the church kitchen's latest batch of soup. Her wooden spoon moved in steady circles, a rhythm that usually brought comfort. But tonight, her hands trembled slightly. The news of Graydon's dramatic board meeting speech had spread through town like wildfire, yet she kept her focus on the task before her, feeding whoever walked through those doors. Ms. Opal worked quietly beside her, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. The kitchen buzzed with other volunteers, their whispered conversations adding to the homey clatter of pots and pans. Micah sat at the corner table, homework spread before him, occasionally glancing at the door. The kitchen's swinging door creaked open. The usual dinner chatter died. Graydon Hale stood in the doorway, his expensive suit wrinkled and his tie loosened. Snow melted on his shoulders. His eyes found Elena immediately, and the raw emotion in them made her grip her spoon tighter. "Elena," he said softly, but in the sudden silence, everyone heard. She kept stirring, her voice barely steady. "The soup's almost ready." "I'm not here for soup." He took a step forward, then another. The volunteers parted like a gentle wave, creating a path between them. "I'm here because I made a terrible mistake." Elena's spoon stilled. Ms. Opal gently took it from her hand, nudging her forward. "I got scared," Graydon continued, his voice growing stronger. "When the press came, when Campbell threatened everything I'd built, I retreated to my safe, empty mansion. I chose silence over standing beside you. I failed you both." Micah looked up from his homework, eyes wide and hopeful. "But sitting there alone," Graydon went on, "surrounded by marble and memories, I realized something. All my wealth, all my careful plans, they mean nothing without family, without love." He gestured to the humble kitchen. "Without this," Elena wrapped her arms around herself, fighting tears. "Graydon, please," he held up a hand, "let me finish. I've spent my life hiding behind boardrooms and bank accounts, but you and Micah showed me what real riches look like. It's puzzle pieces on the floor. It's teaching me to chop onions without crying. It's prayer before meals and holding hands on winter walks." Ruthie sniffled from her spot by the sink. Someone passed her a tissue. "I don't want to be the man who runs when things get hard," Graydon said, taking another step closer. "I want to be the father Micah deserves, the kind who shows up for science fairs and teaches him to tie his shoes, the kind who makes pancakes on Saturday mornings, even if they're a little burnt at first." A watery laugh escaped Elena. Micah had abandoned his homework entirely now, edging closer to them both. "And Elena," Graydon's voice softened, "I want to be worthy of your trust again. Not as a billionaire or a foundation chairman, but as a partner. Someone who stands beside you in this kitchen, who learns from your strength and your faith. Someone who helps build not just houses, but homes." He glanced around the kitchen, at the familiar faces of their neighbors. "I know I can't erase the pain I caused, but if you'll let me, I want to spend every day proving that love matters more than legacy. That family isn't about blood tests or board votes. It's about choosing each other, every single day." Elena's tears fell freely now. "You hurt us," she whispered. "I did," he acknowledged, his own eyes glistening. "And I am so deeply sorry. How do I know you won't run again? Because I finally understand what I was running from." He gestured to the warm kitchen, to the people gathered there. "I was afraid of needing others, afraid of being known. But look at this place. Every pot of soup, every shared meal, every prayer circle. This is what makes life worth living. You and Micah showed me that." Micah couldn't contain himself any longer. He darted forward, small feet pattering on the linoleum floor. Without hesitation, he took Elena's hand in his right and reached for Graydon's with his left. The kitchen held its breath. The church kitchen hummed with energy as people crowded in, drawn by the news of Graydon's bold stand at the board meeting. Elena ladled soup with steady hands, while Micah helped pass out bread rolls. The warmth of acceptance filled the room, but one figure stood apart, hesitating in the doorway. Tessa Burrows, usually so polished and confident, looked smaller somehow. Her designer sweater seemed out of place among the work clothes and aprons. Her hands twisted the strap of her leather purse as she took a tentative step forward. The room gradually quieted as people noticed her presence. Elena felt her spine stiffen, old hurts rising to the surface. But something in Tessa's face, the redness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her chin, made Elena pause. "I need to say something," Tessa announced, her voice wavering. She cleared her throat and squared her shoulders. "Something that's been weighing on me for years." Ms. Opal set down her rolling pin. Ruthie crossed her arms but nodded encouragingly. The veterans at their usual table set down their coffee cups. "Elena," Tessa said, turning to face her directly, "what my mother did to you at the coastal estate, firing you, threatening you, spreading lies." She swallowed hard. It was wrong. So deeply wrong. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of soup pots. Elena's heart pounded as memories of that terrible day flooded back. Being marched off the property, her belongings in a paper bag, shame burning her cheeks. My mother was the head housekeeper, and she let her prejudices rule her actions. Tessa's voice grew stronger, though tears glistened in her eyes. She saw a young Hispanic maid talking to the owner's son, and she. Tessa shook her head. She made assumptions, cruel ones, and I knew it wasn't right, but I stayed quiet. Micah slipped his hand into Elena's, and she squeezed it gently. "I've carried that guilt for years," Tessa continued. "Watching you work so hard here in Willow Bend, raising Micah alone, never complaining, it made me more ashamed of my silence. And then, seeing Graydon choose love and truth over power," she wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. "Well, if he can be that brave, so can I." Elena felt tears rolling down her own cheeks now. The pain of that old injustice had shaped so many years of her life, made her careful and afraid. But here was unexpected healing, flowing like fresh water over parched ground. "I want to make it right," Tessa declared. "Or at least try to. I'm volunteering to chair the housing task force for the Not a Place project. I know about zoning laws and city planning from my real estate work. I can help create homes where everyone belongs, where no one gets pushed out because of who they are or where they come from." The first clap came from old Mr. Jenkins, a veteran who'd worked at the textile plant for 40 years. Others joined in, the applause growing like summer rain. Ms. Blank Taysens, Opal dabbed her eyes with her apron corner. "Count us in too," Mr. Jenkins called out, his gruff voice warm. "Us old-timers from the plant. We'll mentor the new trainees, teach them what we know about textile work, help them learn the ropes. And my diner's always hiring," Ruthie added with a grin. "Already got 3 new families coming in for breakfast tomorrow." Elena looked around the kitchen, at Tessa's honest tears, at the veterans' determined faces, at Ruthie's proud smile. She saw Micah beaming up at her, hope bright in his young eyes. The weight she'd carried for so long began to lift, like ice melting in spring sunshine. "Thank you," she said softly to Tessa, then louder to the room. "Thank you all." Tessa stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, hugged Elena. The gesture was awkward but sincere, bridging years of distance. When they separated, both women were smiling through tears. The kitchen buzzed with renewed energy. Veterans gathered around a table with notepads, already planning training schedules. Ruthie called out soup orders with extra spring in her voice. Ms. Opal hummed as she shaped rolls, and Tessa rolled up her sleeves to help serve. Elena felt it then, a lightness in her chest, as if winter's grip had finally loosened, like the first warm breeze of spring, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new possibilities. The burden of old hurts didn't vanish completely, but it transformed into something different. Wisdom that could help others. Strength that could build bridges. She watched Micah proudly showing Tessa how to ladle soup without dripping, and her heart swelled with joy. This was what healing looked like, not just for her, but for the whole community. one bowl of soup, one honest conversation, one brave choice at a time. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings through Willow Bend. Where the old textile plant once stood idle, construction crews now bustled about, transforming the space into something vibrant and new. The Not a Place project's first phase was taking shape, with modular homes rising from the ground like hope made real. Across town, Graydon stood in front of his newly purchased bungalow, so different from the cold mansion he'd sold. The modest white house with its wraparound porch felt more like home than the estate ever had. Morning sunlight warmed the wooden steps where Elena sat, sorting through packets of tomato seeds. "You sure you want to try growing these yourself?" Elena asked, trying not to smile as Graydon studied the seed packets like they were complex business contracts. "The garden center has plenty of starter plants." "I want to do it right," Graydon insisted, rolling up the sleeves of his plain work shirt. "From the beginning." Micah bounded down the porch steps, garden trowel in hand. "I already dug the holes, Dad. Can we plant them now?" "Hold your horses, my Joe," Elena laughed. "We need to add the good soil first." Together, they worked in comfortable silence, mixing rich potting soil into the flower boxes that lined the porch railings. Graydon's hands, once pristine, now carried the honest dirt of homemaking. He'd learned to take pride in these simple tasks, in creating something with his own two hands. From her house next door, Miss Opal called out, "Y'all better plant those tomatoes deep. Shallow roots make weak plants." "Yes, ma'am," Graydon answered, while Elena whispered, "She's been giving gardening advice all morning." "I heard that, Elena Cruz," Miss Opal shot back, making them all laugh. "And you know I'm right." The neighborhood had changed in these 3 months. Where once stood empty houses and drawn curtains, now porches filled with neighbors sharing coffee and conversation. Every Saturday morning, the veterans gathered at Ruthie's Diner for breakfast before heading to the plant site to mentor the new workforce trainees. Micah carefully dropped seeds into each hole, his face screwed up in concentration. 1, 2, 3, he counted, remembering Elena's instructions. "Then, cover them up gentle." "That's right, son," Graydon said, the word falling naturally from his lips now. He watched as Micah patted the soil with the same care he used with his puzzle pieces. The screen door squeaked, and Elena emerged with a pitcher of lemonade and 3 glasses. They sat on the porch steps, taking a break from their gardening. Across the street, Elena's old duplex stood empty now. They'd moved in together last month, blending their lives as naturally as the soil and seeds they'd just planted. "The community kitchen opens next week," Elena said, pride warming her voice. "Pastor Danny says we're already booked solid for cooking classes." "Of course we are," Ms. Opal chimed in, having made her way over to join them. "Half the town wants to learn your caldo recipe, girl." Graydon squeezed Elena's hand. "They'll have to get in line. I'm still learning." "You managed pancakes without burning them yesterday," Micah pointed out helpfully. "That's better than last month." They all laughed, remembering the smoke alarm incident that had brought 3 concerned neighbors running. Now it was just another story to tell, another thread in the tapestry of their shared life. A truck rumbled past, carrying supplies to the plant site. The driver waved. Everyone waved in Willow Bend these days. The town had found its heart again, beating strong with possibility and purpose. "The first families move into the new homes next month," Graydon said, his voice soft with satisfaction. "Real people, making real homes." "Speaking of homes," Elena said, standing up and disappearing inside. She returned with a wooden sign, hand painted with care. "Micah and I made this yesterday." Graydon took the sign, running his fingers over the letters that spelled out, "Welcome to Elena's table." His eyes grew misty as he looked at the careful brushstrokes, the love painted into every curve and line. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Together, they hung the sign beside the front door, Micah holding the level while Graydon secured the hooks. Elena stepped back to admire their handiwork, her heart full. "Ms." Opal nodded approvingly. "Now that's what I call a proper welcome." She reached into her ever-present bag and pulled out a wrapped bundle. "And every new home needs tea cakes for good luck." "You knew we were hanging the sign today?" Elena asked, accepting the still warm package. "Honey, I know everything that happens on this street, Ms. Opal said with a wink. Always have, always will. Micah ran his fingers over the sign's letters. Can we have breakfast on the porch tomorrow? Like we did at Ms. Opal's last weekend? That's becoming quite the tradition, Graydon said, smiling. I suppose we should get some more chairs. Already ordered them, Elena admitted. They'll be here Thursday. Well then, Graydon said, pulling her close. I guess we're officially open for business. The sign swayed gently in the breeze, catching the morning light. Below it, tomato seeds nestled in warm soil, preparing to grow. And around them, Willow Bend hummed with the sound of community, hammers at the plant site, children playing in yards, and neighbors calling hello across fences. They stood together on the porch, this family built on second chances and soup suppers, watching their town bloom like spring flowers after a long winter. The simple wooden sign said everything they needed to say. Everyone was welcome at their table, in this house that was finally, truly, a home. The late afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the bungalow's wooden floors. Through the open windows, the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting drifted in like a gentle melody. Elena watched as Graydon reached into his pocket, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Micah, he called softly. Could you come here for a minute? The 8-year-old looked up from his puzzle on the coffee table, dark eyes curious. He patted over in his mismatched socks, one blue, one with dinosaurs, that he insisted on wearing for good luck. I have something for you, Graydon said, kneeling down to meet his son at eye level. From his pocket, he pulled out a ring of keys, each one gleaming in the sunlight. They clinked together like wind chimes as he held them out. Micah's eyes widened. Are those for me? They are. Graydon's voice was warm and steady. Each one opened something special. Elena leaned against the doorframe, her heart swelling as she watched them. The past 3 months had transformed their lives in ways she'd never imagined possible. The mansion on the hill stood empty now, its marble floors and echoing halls replaced by the creaky charm of their cozy bungalow. Graydon held up the first key, its brass surface catching the light. This one's for our front door. The blue one opens the church kitchen. Miss Ruthie said, you're old enough to help with Saturday breakfast prep now. Micah bounced on his toes, reaching out to touch the keys with reverent fingers. Really? I can help make the pancakes? Really? Graydon chuckled. And this silver one? It's for the garden shed. Those tomato plants aren't going to water themselves. Elena felt tears welling up as she watched Micah cradle the keys like treasure. She remembered all too well the years when keys meant locked doors and places they didn't belong. Now they were symbols of welcome, of belonging. But you know what's special about these keys? Graydon asked, his voice gentling. When Micah shook his head, he continued. They open doors, but it's the people inside who make it home. Like how Mama's soup makes the church kitchen feel warm even on cold days. Or how your puzzles make our living room the perfect place for thinking. Micah nodded solemnly, understanding beyond his years. And how Ms. Opal says prayer sounds better with friends around? Exactly like that. Graydon ruffled Micah's hair, his own eyes suspiciously bright. These keys mean you belong here, in all these places, with all these people who love you. Elena couldn't hold back her tears anymore. They slipped down her cheeks as she watched her son throw his arms around his father's neck, the keys jingling between them. Can I show Tommy? Micah asked, practically vibrating with excitement. He's playing next door. In a little bit, Elena said, finding her voice. First, we need to get ready for Sunday potluck. Micah carefully tucked the keys into his pocket, patting them to make sure they were secure. I'm going to help set up the tables today, he announced proudly. Since I have a key, and everything. The room filled with laughter. Not the polite, measured kind that used to echo through the Hale estate, but the real, messy joy that came with family. Elena watched as Graydon helped Micah tie his shoes, their dark heads bent together in concentration. In the kitchen, her famous caldo de pollo simmered on the stove, ready for the church potluck. The recipe hadn't changed since that stormy night months ago, but somehow it tasted different now, richer, fuller, seasoned with love and belonging. They gathered their things. Elena's soup in its well-worn pot, Micah's latest puzzle to share with the other kids, and Graydon's attempt at cornbread that was almost perfect, according to Ms. Opal's diplomatic assessment. As they stepped onto the porch, their neighbors waved from their yards and driveways. The converted textile plant hummed in the distance, its new purpose bringing life back to Willow Bend. Construction on Elena's Table Community Kitchen was nearly complete, its windows already catching the afternoon light. Micah walked between them, one hand in Elena's, the other in Graydon's. His keys jingled with each step, a happy rhythm matching their footfalls on the sidewalk. Every few steps, he would pat his pocket, reassuring himself that his new treasure was still there. The church spire rose before them, its shadow stretching long in the late-day sun. Already cars were pulling into the parking lot, and the smell of various dishes wafted through the air. Someone had propped open the fellowship hall doors with a brick, and laughter spilled out into the spring evening. Sunlight spilled over the town like honey, turning everything it touched to gold. It caught in Elena's hair, glinted off Micah's keys, and warmed their faces as they walked together toward the gathering of their neighbors and friends, toward home. The late afternoon sun streamed through the church's stained-glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the long tables that stretched from wall to wall in the fellowship hall. The scent of fresh bread and simmering soup filled the air as people filed in, their voices creating a warm hum of conversation and laughter. Elena stood behind the serving counter, ladling her signature caldo de pollo into bowls. Her hands moved with practiced grace, but her heart fluttered with emotion. This wasn't just another church supper. This was the first official meal of the Not a Place project, marking a new chapter for Willow Bend. Beside her, Graydon carefully arranged fresh cilantro on each bowl, his movements deliberate and focused. He'd insisted on helping serve, despite being the project's founder. "Real leaders serve first," he'd said simply. The crisp sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, and a light blue apron, embroidered with Elena's Table, protected his clothes. Micah bounced between them, passing out napkins and silverware with enthusiastic efficiency. "Welcome to our table!" he called out to each person, beaming with pride. His dinosaur socks peeked out beneath his khakis as he moved, still his lucky charm for special occasions. Ms. Opal supervised the bread baskets, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Child," she called to a shy teenager, "take 2 pieces. You're growing faster than spring flowers." The girl smiled, ducking her head as she accepted the extra portion. Ruthie bustled in through the side door, carrying a massive pot of her famous chicken and dumplings. "The diner's closed early," she announced, "because family supper matters more than business tonight." Several veterans hurried to help her with the heavy pot, their faces bright with purpose. The line of people moved steadily, each face familiar now to Graydon. There was Tom from the plant's new training program, his wife Sarah cradling their newborn. Behind them, Mrs. Chen from the corner store chatted with Pastor Danny about the community garden's spring planning. Tessa arrived with architectural drawings tucked under her arm, the latest designs for the pocket neighborhoods. She'd thrown herself into the housing task force with passionate dedication, working to right old wrongs through action rather than just words. "The first units will be ready by Christmas," she told Elena, accepting a bowl of soup. "And the community kitchen, Elena's kitchen officially, will open even sooner." Elena blushed at the name, still unused to such recognition. "As long as it feeds people," she said softly, "that's all that matters." The hall filled quickly, every table a perfect mixture of old-timers and newcomers, wealthy and working class, all sharing bread and conversation. Children wove between chairs, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the deeper murmur of adult voices. When everyone was served, Elena, Graydon, and Micah filled their own bowls and found seats at the center table. Ms. Opal joined them, along with Pastor Danny and his wife. The familiar wood of the church chairs felt more comfortable than any fancy restaurant seating. Pastor Danny stood, raising his hands for quiet. The conversation gradually stilled as faces turned toward him expectantly. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I'd like to thank the Hale Foundation, and more importantly, the Hale, Cruz family, for making this vision reality. Not just the buildings and programs, but this." He gestured to the gathered community. This is what healing looks like. Graydon squeezed Elena's hand under the table. Micah, sitting between them, straightened proudly in his chair. And now, Pastor Danny continued with a smile, let's bless this food, and the hands that prepared it. Heads bowed across the hall. Elena felt Graydon's hand warm in hers, heard Micah's whispered, Amen, at the prayer's end. When she opened her eyes, she found Graydon watching her and Micah with an expression of quiet wonder. I was wrong, you know, he said softly. His words meant just for them, although the sentiment seemed to encompass the whole room. Home isn't a place at all. It's who's at the table. Micah nodded sagely, already spooning soup with his free hand. That's why we needed lots of tables, right, Dad? Exactly right, son. Graydon's voice caught slightly on the word son, still new enough to hold magic. Around them, the room came alive with the sounds of spoons clinking against bowls, bread being broken, and conversations flowing as naturally as the soup being shared. Veterans traded stories with plant workers while their children compared trading cards. Ms. Opal held court at one end of their table, dispensing wisdom and extra cornbread in equal measure. Elena looked across the sea of faces, all so familiar now, all part of this expanding definition of family, and felt tears prick at her eyes. These were happy tears, the kind that came from watching love multiply rather than divide. She remembered that first stormy night, walking through snow with a pot of soup, never imagining it would lead to this moment. Graydon noticed her tears and passed her a napkin discreetly. His own eyes were suspiciously bright as he watched Micah demonstrate his latest puzzle-solving technique to Pastor Danny's youngest daughter. "Shall we pray?" Micah asked suddenly, reaching for both their hands. It was their family tradition now, this second prayer, just the three of them. They bowed their heads, hands clasped tight. Around them, laughter rose and fell like music. Steam curled up from bowls of soup, carrying the scent of home-cooked love. Through the windows, the setting sun painted the room in warm golds and gentle pinks, a reminder that even the darkest storms eventually break into light. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Elena Cruz, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.